This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
Talk Genealogy, the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
This month we're going to chat about family traditions and how do we find out the truth of these half-truths.
The Talk Genealogy podcast looks at different techniques and interesting sources for family historians. Or perhaps a discussion about early genealogists, the pioneers of our science. Sometimes we look at how a famous character in history shows us something particular about genealogy. But hey, most of the time we talk about whatever comes into our head, building an audio library for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
Thanks for being there. You know, it makes an awful lot more sense if you are. In this month's podcast, I'm going to share with you one or two stories from my own family history. Then we'll remember what one of the pioneers of Victorian genealogy had to say about some yarns. And we'll end up by recommending a watertight technique for finding out the truth. In the magazine section, we're going to recommend a podcast, a book and a website. And if that all makes sense to you, then you're in the right place.
Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast, the podcast for the genealogists with too much time on their hands. Here is your presenter, Malcolm Noble.
You know, I love family traditions. There's a dogma which says they are bad family history, but hey, come on, the history of the story is as much of the history as the story. Oh, I like that. Let's say it again. The history of the story is as much of the history as the story. I think the thing for me is that there's an element of truth. And then there's the fun of trying to work out what made the story grow. The who and the when and the sometimes why. I've initiated a family tradition myself. Well, I hope I have. Time will tell. Did you know that John of Gaunt used to hunt pigs in my back garden? We live on a stretch of Leicestershire that used to be called Foxton Moor, and it's easy to picture it as an unkempt, rough and certainly windswept portion of England with ominous shadows on stormy nights.
John of Gaunt, one of the richest men in the realm, was the fourth son of Edward III and the father of King Henry IV. He was a powerful player during the regime of King Edward and later his nephew Richard II. He is the patriarch of the House of Lancaster.
Well, John of Gaunt favoured Foxton Moor for his boar hunting. Of course, I cannot say that he actually covered the tiny patch of the moor which is my back garden. But, and this is the point when talking about family traditions, no one can say that it isn't true. My own family are already repeating the yarn, and I'll know that I've contributed to their weight of folk history when my neighbours start talking about it. Other traditions, well, my great-great-great-great-grandfather is said to have been born in a field. But hey, the main family tradition is that we were something to do with the Templars. My father's side of the family knew nothing of its history. The family were 300 years in a nearby village until 1920. My father was born 4 years later, but he'd never heard of the little parish until we dug up the family tree. Then I was talking to his sister, my aunt, and she announced she was sure we were something to do with the Templars. Wow, did I find that attractive. I loved the idea that I was descended from some sort of knight-errant who rode around the country helping the hard-pressed, or, who can gainsay, rescuing a damsel distressed in her tower. Things started well. The earliest evidence of our surname is Peter Lenoble in 1185, who with his son Henry was listed with the Templars of Huntington. Well, that's near our roots in Cambridgeshire. But hold on. The lay subsidy of the 1320s lists no less than 40 households with the surname or its derivatives, a number that was unlikely to have descended from old Pete in less than 130 years. So things seemed unlikely as our research went forward. Then I established our link with the village of Wilbraham in Cambridgeshire, and lo and behold, local history asserted not only that the Templars owned land in the parish, but there was even a Templars chapel there. So it could be that the family were not part of the movement, but were tenants on the land owned or formerly owned by the Templars.
Walter Scott based his Templar seminary in Ivanhoe at Wilbraham.
You mean I could be descended from Ivanhoe? No, please. One tradition at a time. Now I'm trying to find all I can about the Templars in Wilbraham. The quest continues, but let's remember that the Duchess of Cleveland had something to say about family traditions, and she wasn't all scathing. She could see their value. Now, we spoke about her in our episode on descendants of William the Conqueror, so let's just remember that now. Let's recall that snatch of the episode. I have found the pursuit of truth, a path bristling with thorns and beset with pitfalls. One of the chief difficulties to be met is the confusion caused by contradictory statements that no ingenuity can reconcile. Until I commenced this undertaking, I had no conception how deep a root these ancient lineages had struck in the land, and how numerous and widely spread their ramifications were. I have retained the picturesque old legends that have been so long associated with them as to form part of their history. What would De Vere be without his meteor star, or De Albany without his conquered lion? I have also given all the anecdotes that I could collect, partly to relieve the inherent dullness of a mere catalogue of descent, and partly because many of them incidentally furnish vivid pictures of the manners and customs long since passed away. Now, a lot of family historians would dispute that approach, but I think the Duchess shows a nice balance between the romance of it all, and let us not lose that, and the need for a critical approach.
TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands. You find a guide to previous episodes, a list of books mentioned in the series, and now and then, a bit of a blog. Recommended by Who Do You Think You Are magazine and featured on BBC Radio. Here is Malcolm Noble's Talk Genealogy podcast.
In a moment or two, we will be looking at a strategy for bottoming out these family traditions. But in this magazine section of tonight's podcast, I want to recommend a website, a book, and a podcast. That's what we like to do each month. And for the book, it's always a very hard choice. But I have decided any one of the 14 editions of the Genealogy and Local History Handbook. It is a directory of services, so to a certain extent it was overtaken by the development of the internet. But it lasted, I think, for 14 different editions, starting out in 1997. And while, the addresses are there, there's loads of them, hundreds of them, of useful organisations. That directory may be more valuable now for suggesting what's about rather than where it is, because obviously addresses change. But each of these editions have a wealth of ancillary featured articles, and they are well worth looking at. They look at everything within the realms of genealogy and local history. And so the Directory of Services, the Genealogy and Local History Handbook, is well worth looking out for. You can get very cheap second-hand copies, or you can go onto the My History website, where they are offering a CD of all the 14 editions. When it comes to the website, well, at the moment I am putting together a episode of the Talk Genealogy podcast on the sound of Bow Bells. It's 3 or 4 down the queue, so don't expect it before the end of the summer. But you may want to look at the website of Mary Le Bow, the church at the centre of the Cockney region of London. It is full of history. It is full of links to other lectures, and I think I can guarantee that you will find something there that will lead you to some useful sources for your family history research. That's the website for Mary Le Bow Church in the middle of London. And for the podcast, I want to recommend the latest edition, talking about March 2025, of the podcast by the British Association for Local History. In this episode, they invite Laura Yeoman. What a lovely surname. Hey, what a lovely surname. Laura Yeoman to talk about her work at the Borthwick Institute, loosely titled Enabling Archives. Hope you'll enjoy looking at those. You know, one of the many idle pleasures of this genealogist with too much time on his hands is browsing through old copies of Countryman magazine. For me, the heyday of this pocket-sized, almost digest really, was the 1950s, when it had to strike a balance between modern rural affairs and nostalgia, which it does very nicely. And of course the 1950s by now have become nostalgic themselves. I was browsing through the summer of 1954 edition with my coffee this morning on the garden bench, and pulled out a couple of items that I thought might be interesting to family tree hunters. The first one is in the correspondence section, where a letter writer from Manchester tells us that many of the ancient gravestones in the porch of Bakewell Church have symbols indicating the trade or occupation of the deceased. The most easily recognisable are the sword of the soldier, the horn of the trumpeter, the bow of the archer, and the chalice of the priest. He also mentions a key for the locksmith and shears for the ship shearer, although in the illustration, I have to say, the shears to me do look very similar to those used by thatchers in the old days. But you know, I was really taken by the article by a lady called Mary Richards on the churchyard problem, and she told us that our churchyard is full. 10 months ago, in the parish magazine, the vicar begged his parishioners to send him their views on what should be done about it. Of course, no one did. Later, he called a meeting in the church vestry, but only 6 people turned up, including his wife and mother-in-law. So he was obliged to call a public meeting in the parish hall, to which higher clerics were invited to give it some importance. What a lovely picture of an early post-war village and village affairs. Mary goes on to tell us that there the vicar pointed out that it was a practice in other places, when the churchyard was full, was to take up the old headstones, level the ground and use it again. If this had not been done, churches built centuries ago would now be surrounded by acres and acres of burial ground. Okay, the debate rose to and fro before the paper presents this really, really nice vignette as its conclusion. Mrs. Morley then rose. She lives alone in the big house, owns half the village, and is an old inhabitant, and has most of her relatives buried in the churchyard. She attacked the whole meeting. Newcomers whose loved ones, if they had any, lay elsewhere urged us to adopt foreign ways. This was dictatorship in its worst form. Christianity was mocked by this wicked proposition. At that point, the meeting was hurriedly brought to a close with the declaration that both sides had been aired and now the parish had to think about it. What a lovely picture. I've an experience from my own family tree where when I first found the gravestone was propped against the church wall. Next time I visited, it was laid down and propped against the church. The next time, it was part of the church pathway.
Did you catch some of our recent episodes? Episode 49 featured 3 Australian brothers, while episode 48 discussed Admiral Sir John Hawkins. Take Peeps, for example, was episode 30, while number 35 looked at marriage registers and 31 discussed church wardens. TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
When we set out a research strategy to bottom out our family traditions, we need to rely on my favourite mantra. Come on, let's say it together. Evidence, analysis, hypothesis and proof. But there is a slight difference because, of course, we are not expecting to prove the story. A good tradition is one that can't be proved, but on the other hand, no one can say that it isn't true. Let's follow my progress on the investigation that I've quoted. Now, I need to concede that I wasn't quite this disciplined. I enjoyed being haphazard and for years wouldn't bother at all with the question. It was a lazy aspect of my family history, a true task for the genealogist with too much time on his hands.
Here's some earlier episodes of the podcast. Episode 15. Let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Episode 13 was about the hearth tax. Episode 12, and it was Shakespeare, for example. Episode 9 discussed the medieval pipe rolls. Go to episode 7 for the companions of William the Conqueror. Episode 2, the Herald's Visitations, and our very first episode looked at working with Tudor wills. Building an audio library for the genealogists with too much time on their hands.
In collecting the evidence, I needed some reference points, places, people and times, and all I had as a time span was the age of the Templars, say the 12th century to the 14th century, roughly. I only had one person, my aunt, and the location was likely to be, well, East Anglia, but especially Cambridge and Suffolk. That's where the lane subsidies came in. So I wrote these 4 items on a piece of paper. The Templars, my aunt, East Anglia, and the 12th to the 14th century, and put a circle around each so it was like they were in a bubble. And then to each of those bubbles I attached spider's legs and labelled them with research opportunities. So East Anglia had the lay subsidies, county histories, village histories, and the family tree. Now that family tree leg also connected with a leg attached to my aunt. My goodness me, try not to visualize this. And that was, of course, the family tree as well. Now the objective is to find a research opportunity that connects all 4 bubbles on the piece of paper, and that became the little village of Wilbraham. Now, the strength of this approach is the tight focus it gives to your research, but it is also its Achilles heel. You must keep an open mind that the answer may not actually be on this bit of paper at all. But currently, my hypothesis is as follows. We may or may not be descended from two of the Templars that are identified, Peter and Henry Noble. More probably, we were associated with some land in Little Wilbraham that was owned by the Templars. And in the 17th century, the family moved from that village to the next village, and within a generation moved again to the next village. So that by the time that the grandson of that second moved asked the question, where do we come from? He was talking about the generation of his great-great-grandfather. And that's when he was told that we were something to do with the Templars. Now, let's just stretch imagination a little. Wouldn't it be nice if that legend or myth or tradition was based on a document now lost? But I'm afraid no mention of Ivanhoe.
Did you catch some of our recent episodes? Episode 49 featured 3 Australian brothers, while episode 48 discussed Admiral Sir John Hawkins. Take Peeps, for example, was episode 30, while number 35 looked at marriage registers and 31 discussed church wardens. TalkGenealogy.com is the website that supports the podcast for genealogists with too much time on their hands.
This evening we have been talking about family traditions, those stories that cannot be proved but no one can say they didn't happen. I sought support from the Duchess of Cleveland in promoting the value of these myths and legends. I spoke about one in particular, that my family was something to do with the Templars. I suggested a research strategy with bubbles and spiders' legs, where research is directed towards joining up the spider's legs. Well, you get what I mean. And don't forget, evidence, analysis, hypothesis and proof. Did you enjoy our magazine section with pictures of old village meetings to discuss the future of the graveyard and gravestones embossed with tools of the trade? My name is Malcolm Noble, and if you've enjoyed tonight's podcast, then you are the genealogist with too much time on your hands.
The Talk Genealogy podcast is posted at 5 minutes to midnight on the third Thursday of each month. Thanks to Freeze Effects for the music and Momna Yunus and Emily Brooks for the voiceovers. This podcast comes from the corner of a country lane in the middle of England.
I want to thank you for listening to tonight's episode and wish you all the best with your family tree hunting. Good night, Chip, and thanks for listening.